Where are we sitting? Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm David McIntosh, Chairman McHenry. I lead or co-chair with Tim Ryan, my Democrat colleague, a bipartisan blockchain innovation project supported by Club for Growth and the Democrat political group called the Moderates. And the reason we work together is Bitcoin and crypto should be a bipartisan issue for this country. And so I'm delighted now to spend a few minutes in a fireside chat with Chairman McHenry, who has been one of the great leaders on Capitol Hill for Bitcoin and lighter, reasonable regulation of crypto so that our entire nation can benefit from this technology. First, Patrick, why did you choose to come here today?
Well, because this is where the action is. I mean, this is a bastion of freedom, and it's always a welcome thing in Washington when foreign dignitaries come to town espousing freedom in a place that is that it should be deeply respected and loved. Look, the way I view Bitcoin is, what Satoshi brought into this world has been unstoppable. Every regime that's tried to shut it down has failed. Even the Chinese Communist Party that tried to shut down Bitcoin couldn't. And so it is an unstoppable piece of technology that I'm trying to convince policymakers on the Hill to embrace and for the United States to be leaders in rather than fall behind. And I want to make sure that you all hear that message clearly. There are a lot of pretenders to the world of crypto. Some are in prison now.
Yes.
And rightfully so. But the true technologists, the true innovators, and the true leaders in understanding the technology, embracing the technology, and deploying it are free. And they're innovating. And we need to embrace that. We need the United States to be leaders in this generation of technology rather than falling behind.
You're so right. So sticking to the theme of Bitcoin, the critics really have two arguments that they make against it. One is that it uses too much energy to create or discover new Bitcoin. And the other is that criminals and bad guys around the world use it to do nefarious activities. What's your response to those?
Well, even the Biden administration has given up the goat on the energy question. The grid is far more resilient. Bitcoin mining can happen at off-peak hours in coordination with power companies. It's a non-issue. And so that's number one. Number two, illicit finance. The dumbest way to try to obscure your transactions are to do them in public. And the level of embarrassment when senators and members of the House ask questions about this on how to obscure these transactions, and when you have to explain to them that this is an open ledger, that people can see the movement of value, and they don't understand that. So the illicit finance question, cash is still king in illicit finance. The testimony we've had from the Biden Treasury Department confirms that is the number one way to move illicit funds globally is using U.S. dollars in cash. And so that question has become really the lodestar of a few politicians' argument against crypto, and it's an untruth. It is not an essential element. We still have the key elements of AML BSA standards that U.S. domiciled on-ramps and off-ramps follow very, very well. And they should be commended for following the law here in the United States. We do have a challenge internationally, but we still have a challenge with U.S. cash being used internationally for illicit purposes. So, I think that they're trying to make this quite the show rather than actually get on with embracing some level of clarity.
You knocked it out of the park on both of those. Looking at the broader landscape for crypto, and Bitcoin gets caught up in that, there are a lot of very legitimate uses for the blockchain technology, but we've also seen pump and dump scams and fraudulent behavior that you referred to earlier. What do you see as, and I know you've done a lot of work on this in your legislation, but how do we set up a regime to decipher those which would let the United States be a leader internationally?
First, there's no definition. We have IRS putting out rulings on the tax consequences of owning Bitcoin. We don't have in federal law a definition of a digital asset. We don't have in federal law a means of exchange for a digital asset. We have to provide that clarity. And in fact, we went through this in the late 1800s here in the United States before we had a federal definition of what was ownership of a company. So we've gone through this period of a lack of clarity, and then we've had to catch up. And the federal government has to catch up in this definition. The legislation we reported out of the House Financial Services Committee with bipartisan votes. Number one is the FIT 21 Act, authored and led by French Hill, which provides that clarity of a definition of a digital asset. It would state clearly what is a commodity, what is a security, for digital assets, and it would create a means of exchange. We have a second piece of legislation that provides clarity on what is a stable coin under a federal regime, modeled after the New York State law defining a stable coin. And so those are two pieces of legislation that could provide greater clarity here and put the U.S. back in the game when it comes to not just being a leading edge of using Bitcoin, trading Bitcoin, but also broader set of digital assets.
And what do you see as the social good of setting that framework?
Look, I mean, we've taken a lot of people out of this. More Americans own stocks and bonds and a piece of the U.S. economy today than they did 2 generations ago. That is a good thing. Linking up greater ownership of society with the mass population is a very good thing. Likewise, digital ownership and digital assets are on that leading edge of ownership. It says to me freedom, it says to me innovation, technological innovation, and those two things we should widely embrace. And and nothing is more emblematic of those two things than Bitcoin.
When I was first introduced to Bitcoin, everybody I talked to said, "Why can't this be bipartisan?" What's your experience? I know over in the Senate, Elizabeth Warren's very opposed to crypto, Bitcoin, anything in the private sector, and sometimes seems to speak for many of the Democrats. You mentioned you had bipartisan support for your bill. How has that been working? Have we been able to keep this a bipartisan issue? We have. And look, I've been working with my counterpart on the Financial Services Committee for the last 2 years on a stablecoin legislation, a piece of legislation. We have a pretty solid understanding of one another there. I think there's an opportunity for us to have a good legislative outcome there, but a solid product that could stand the test of time. What I see from the left is those that are interested in learning about what Bitcoin is. If they just take the time to read Satoshi's white paper, it is a much easier conversation thereafter. Same thing for some of my colleagues on the right. That they just need to spend a little time to understand, and if they understand, I think they will come to the light here. The lack of understanding, the willfulness of not reading and understanding Bitcoin
right? Just the basics of a blockchain that Satoshi explains better than anyone else. That lack, that willfulness to not educate themselves leads them down rabbit holes of misinformation, and speaking untruths based off of misinformation. And I think that is the foundational problem for those that want to be against something that is a new asset class. And all they think of is financializing something rather than seeing the underlying benefits for ownership without an intermediary, and an intermediary being enriched on the exchange between two individuals. The individual is getting the benefit out of that. So that misinformation is something that we have to push back against. It is a malevolent and nasty thing in our society writ large, but nothing worse than the nastiness preached about digital assets based on grave falsehoods, and so we've got to push back on that.
That's excellent. Two things on that. One, when I was starting to learn about this, I would run into people who were not thinking of it as a financial asset, as you mentioned. They were thinking, much like the tech revolution in the 90s, how do we apply this technology to get greater efficiency in record keeping? One of the folks that we support in a race in Ohio set up a company to put car titles on the blockchain. Another person I ran into was going to do transfers of money through Bitcoin that would save trillions of dollars on the fees that would. That type of innovation gets lost when it gets talked about as a financial asset. What would everyone here has an interest in Bitcoin and in the crypto world? What would you say to them that they could do to be helpful to educate?
I think having relationships with your members of Congress, that's your congressman, your two senators. You need to have those relationships, and you need to be the on-call expert for their staff. And that means going in and explaining at the most basic level what is Bitcoin, what the technological infrastructure is, and then the societal benefit of ownership and what that means. You have to take the time for education in order to go to the next step in policymaking. And we're still heavily in the educational phase for members of Congress. The key thing to remind members of Congress, though, is that we now have this thing that is not defined in federal law. There is complete lack of clarity in the United States on what is a digital asset at all. Yet we have 20% of the American people own or use that thing that the federal government can't figure out what to define. The American people are speaking, they're defining it, the technology is defining it. What we have to do is have federal law catch up to what are the facts on the ground, and to make sure that policymakers know that they should not be against their constituents' interests in how they vote on Capitol Hill. So education, as you know, David, is so key, and you spent so much time working on that. And with your bipartisan coalition, you've created it makes a big difference for those of us policymakers on the Hill that are trying to move solid policy.
We want to help create allies for you. You've been doing this for quite a while. You were an early adopter, early person to understand it. And with your position now as chairman of the Financial Services Committee, been able to exercise great leadership in this area. A few months ago, you announced you were retiring. That made me sad, I have to say. But what are your goals in the remaining months? Do you think we can get the bills through?
Yeah, my hope is to get policy enacted in law. I think we can get. I think we can get our stablecoin policy set through and signed into law. That will be the first sign that there is hope and there is bipartisanship when it comes to this this world of digital assets. Number one. Number two, I believe we can create some level of clarity by a definition. which would then codify a property right that all of you know to be true, but we need to have federal law define it correctly and to make sure that your property is protected. And so I think we can do those two things this year. I've got a number of other policy bills. Digital data privacy is really an update to our data privacy standards for the financial realm is really desperately needed. It's a major priority of mine to push that. And then to make sure that we have greater clarity around those that are trying to invest in small businesses and have new investment opportunities. There's a set of priorities there that I'm going to try to see through. But if we can get clarity around digital assets, that is going to be the biggest win of my 20 years in Congress.
That would be fantastic. Let me ask a more personal question. What are your hopes or plans for life after Congress?
I don't know yet. Yeah, I got to go figure that out. I've been doing this my whole adult life. I mean, I was in the state legislature. This is my 20th year in Congress. I'm 48 years old. So, I can go have another career, and I hope to put one together. I just don't know what that looks like.
Well, we hope we'll see more of you in thought leadership. We need that from outside Congress as well as inside. So thank you. Thank you for your service.
Thanks, David. Thanks for your leadership. Thank you all.